My Schizophrenic Life, The True Story of Tracy Poe, Part 9 Work, Part 1, Chapter 39 ABFZ Oil Tools. I went to a temporary service called Manpower, and they hired me full-time at $6 an hour. The first job they sent me to was for one day and was loading a truck. The second job they sent me to was at a tanker truck repair company and was cleaning up an ink spill. I worked hard cleaning up the spill and got ink all over my clothes. I would buy secondhand clothes at a resale shop in Pasadena, so it was no big deal. The foreman was impressed with me, but had no jobs available, so the ink spill job only lasted 2 days. Manpower then sent me to ABFZ Oil Tools Drill Mortex in Pearland, Texas. It was on the industrial drive in the outskirts of Pearland. The company had a metal building with offices in the front and a large covered work area in the back. Then they had about a half-acre of yard covered with crushed limestone caliche. In this yard were stored 1,000+ drilling tools for oil field production. They were doing their annual inventory and wanted temporary employees that had had some college, and I had had 2.5 years of it. I was sent there with a guy named Harold. There were 2 brothers there that were temporary employees, but they were leaving in a week. Harold and I started inventorying all the oil field parts, and at the end of the first day, David and John, the bosses, told us they wanted us to come back, and that we would be permanent temporaries to take the place of the 2 brothers that were leaving. David oversaw the drill Mortex equipment, and John oversaw ABFZ Oil Tools equipment. The only paperwork that they had were shipping invoices of items coming in and items going out. John had a file that someone showed him how to set it up, and he had 2 sections: incoming equipment invoices and outgoing equipment invoices, all filed by date. David did not have a system. He had stacks of invoices all over his desk, and when he needed a certain one, he would frantically dig through the pile until he found it. Bills received for shipping costs were mailed to the main offices in Houston. Word came down that ABFZ Oil Tools and Drill Mortex were going to split. Harold and I were told to decide which company we wanted to stay with. Harold wanted to go with Drill Mortex, and I wanted to go with ABFZ Oil Tools, so it worked out when each company kept one temporary, and Harold and I got to go with the company that we wanted to go with. John was a Marine during the Vietnam War and was an artilleryman like me. He lived in New Caney, which was an hour's drive away. He liked to wait for traffic to die down before he left after work. He would send one of us to the store for beer, and after 5 p.m. we would each drink 6 beers until about 6 p.m. ABFZ Oil Tools had districts all over the United States and internationally. The districts would call and order a tool they saw on the IBM computer inventory. I would go out on a forklift and find the tool in the yard by its serial number and bring it to the shop. We would build a wood frame and band the tool to it. For smaller parts, we built boxes out of plywood. Then we would fill out a carbon invoice form that had 4 pages. One of the executive workers at the Houston district had given me a programmable typewriter to use. I would type the form on my typewriter, and I had all the addresses programmed into that typewriter. We would call a shipping company and have it picked up and shipped. The yellow copy of the invoice went in our file. The pink copy went as a packing slip. The blue copy was mailed to the district, and the white top copy was mailed to Houston, where the main offices were located. We received bills from the shipping companies, but these were mailed to the Houston offices also to be paid. When we received a tool from the districts, we would check it in with the packing slip that came with it, and then put it out in the yard amongst the similar tools of its type. Then file the packing slip in the file by date. This is how John and I worked. Harold and David would handwrite their invoices, build a box, as Drill Mortex parts were generally small, and load the parts in the box. Then call the shipping company and ship it, then mail the blue and white copies to whomever, and stack the yellow invoice on David's desk. John would say he wanted to take a dump on all the papers on David's desk. To be honest, David probably would not notice if he did. It was such a mess. David would sit around with a calculator and say things like, if you had $20,000 that you were not using and you invested it at 30% in 10 years, you could buy the Houston Oilers football team. He wasted the day away when they were not busy typing on his calculator and dreaming of money he did not have. One time a shipping agent had given them a bottle of Jack Daniels. After work, David got drunk and cried while talking about his brother. One time, David was away from the office and called Harold and told him to get a hot shot delivery driver to take a single part to Louisiana. A hot shot delivery is where you rent a whole truck. and a delivery to Louisiana was over $300. The part was a little metal ring. The Louisiana district called and complained about the delivery, saying they wanted it sent by bus. David neglected to tell Harold to send the part hotshot to the bus station in Houston, so Harold hotshot it all the way to Louisiana. John had to hire another temporary, as there were some large upcoming shipments of small items that were going out that would need boxes. David got John to hire through Manpower his brother by telling John that his brother was a good carpenter. David's brother was a heroin junkie who had been going to the methadone clinic. The first morning he was there, he was getting some coffee and said, "I brought my special mug. I have had this mug for years." Then he dropped it, and it broke. John had him build a box, and it was horrible. And when David complained to his brother about it, he said, "Well, David, you know I cannot cut a straight line." Me and Harold rode with him into town to get lunch, and his ashtray was full of marijuana roaches. Then in the shop, I saw John kicking a marijuana roach on the floor, not knowing what it was. Harold and I confronted David's brother, and he said, "Well, it was not mine." And we said, "Yeah, and that's exactly what your brother will say." David's brother did not last long at ABFZ Oil Tools. I used to get asked to work over hire at the Alley Theater, and John would let me off for a few days, so I could. It was for the properties department, and was usually for a single day. But once John let me off all week to work over hire for the set construction department as a carpenter, this new tech director liked me and said she was going to hire me full-time, so I gave a notice at work. But then they called my work and told me that that was not going to happen. Then they overhired me for a few days, and I found out that the tech director had given the job to her friend. I worked on a lot of shows at the Alley Theater like A Christmas Carol, The Three Sisters, and Glengarry Glen Ross. One day, at the start of summer 1990, the Alley Theater called me, and they wanted to hire me for 6 weeks for their big summer production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Then Jeff from University of Houston at Clear Lake Theater called me and wanted to hire me as the tech director for the 1990 Shaw Festival, so I quit at ABFZ Oil Tools to work these jobs. Chapter 40. Building my house. In January 1989, I got a deed of trust for some land I was purchasing in Brazoria County between Manvel and Alvin. I planned to build a house out there. I designed an 8-foot by 8-foot structure that I wanted to start with. It was the base for a shack that I hoped to expand on. My friend, teacher, and boss Jeff from the University of Houston at Clear Lake Theater Department helped me get the initial load of lumber out to my land in his truck. The lot of land I was purchasing was 300 feet wide at the road and 800 feet long. The front section stayed dry, but the back section was a seasonal wetland. Brazoria County was prone to flooding. In the back it flooded every spring and was generally dry around November until April or May when the rains came. It was dry in the back in January of 1989, and Jeff was able to pull his truck back there with the lumber I had bought to build a frame for one small room. I built a standard house frame, but I used 3 4x4 posts on each end with a low half wall of 2x4s set on 16-inch centers on one side and an even lower half wall of 2x4s set on 16-inch centers on the other side. Both these low walls had 4x4 posts on the ends and in the middle that went up 8 feet. The other 2 walls were all 2x4s that were 8 feet tall, but one wall had a window opening framed in it, and the other wall had a door framed in it. The room inside was just 8 feet by 8 feet wide. The roof of this structure was 2 4x8 feet sheets of plywood. I planned to have a second story. The taller half wall I left as open windows above the 4-foot wall. On the lower half wall, I built a 4 feet by 8 feet sleeping platform with a tin roof coming off the top of the 8-foot wall. During the summer, this 4 by 8 feet elevated room was open, but in the winter, I boarded it up to make it warmer. I eventually framed the top floor. I built a shaped roof and had a 4 by 8 feet extension, 7 feet tall as an elevated porch off the front of it. The whole thing was sided in scrap lumber I got from a toy store I worked at for a few weeks when I was hanging around with Connie. Her mother worked there, and I was only getting 20 hours a week at the theater at University of Houston at Clear Lake, so I had gotten an extra job. The toy store had gotten new shelving in the back area and gave me a bunch of tongue and groove lumber, so I used it as siding. It was a rough-looking structure, but it had potential in my opinion. The back area of my land flooded, so during the dry season at the end of the summer, we would take shovels, dig holes, and pile the dirt up to make elevated walkways and islands for when it flooded. I had put about a foot of dirt into the floor of my shack to keep it from flooding also. David's brother Greg and David's friend Paul. The guy who also got a letter from Cheryl when he was in the Navy would come to my land and dig a lot of these walkways. They loved digging out at my land. They would tell their parents that they would go to my land and dig, and their parents wanted to know what kind of drug that was. David, my friend from 3rd grade, had a girlfriend named Rachel, and she had a brother named Robin. Robin was a gun nut, and David, Greg, and Robin liked to shoot guns at my land. I had over 3 acres, so this was legal. I did not like guns because of my accident, but would let them shoot at my land anyway. I started to collect black powder guns because I thought they were safer as they only had 1 shot and were slow to reload. Mainly, I had a New Englander 12-gauge shotgun that was cut down with a 20-inch barrel and a Walker Colt .44 caliber pistol that I took out there. They were both black powder guns. I could load them both with number 9 birdshot and use them for snakes. The shotgun had wads that held the shot in and separated the shot from the powder, and you used 2 of them in every load. You could get wads for the pistol that were used to prevent flashover, where more than 1 round fires out of the cylinder. With these pistol wads, you could load the pistol like a shotgun with number 9 birdshot. I did this because there were big water moccasins at my land. I had 2 .58 caliber rifles that we shot for fun. One was a single-barrel Thompson Center Big Bore .58 caliber Wild Pig rifle, and the other was a Kodiak .58 caliber double-barrel bear rifle that my brother gave me for Christmas one year. I still had the 2 rifles from my accident, but I did not like them and never took them out there. I was out there with Paul one time, and we were shooting the .58 caliber single-barrel rifle. You could safely load 120 grains of black powder into it, which was the powder measure set to maximum capacity. We hung a 2-liter soda bottle full of water on a string and swung it. Paul went to shoot it and asked, "Do I aim high or low?" I told him, "You aim true, and she will fire true." He fired the big bore rifle, and as usual, a huge cloud of gray smoke came out of it. Then, as the smoke drifted off, we could see the 2-liter bottle was gone, and in its place was a rainbow from the mist of the water that erupted from the bottle when he hit it. One time, I shot a small water moccasin snake with my black powder shotgun. However, I really did not like guns anymore and would rarely take them out to my land when I was alone. So one time when I was out there without a gun, I killed a big water moccasin with half a brick. I threw the brick and hit the snake on the back of the head, then finished it with a shovel once it was incapacitated. The problem with my land was that I was alone out there most of the time, and when I am alone is when I would have schizophrenic symptoms. It got to where I thought the shack was haunted because of my symptoms. I would hear the mumbling weather radio voices I could not understand and voices I could understand that scared me. When I would sleep out there, I would not sleep in the shack but had a cot over by a cypress tree where I would stay. Even there I had problems. Whenever I laid down, I would feel something crawling on top of me. It was a form of sleep paralysis. One time during a sleep paralysis episode, I thought I woke up but was obviously dreaming because there was a monkey with dreadlocks sitting on me. I pulled a dreadlock from the monkey and put it in my pocket to prove it had been there. But when I woke up, nothing was there. My symptoms got so bad when I was out there alone that I could not stay out there comfortably. I thought there was a hag spirit haunting my land. In the year 1995, I had moved across Houston for work and stopped going out there completely. In 1997, I stopped paying for it and signed the deed of trust back to the owner's son, who was executor of the estate of the lady I bought it from after her death. Chapter 41 Theater Work. I had quit my job with Manpower working at ABFZ Oil Tools because I had gotten overhire work at the Alley Theater in the month of April and the first 2 weeks of May 1990 on the show Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the show was playing in June. I was also hired as the technical director for the 1990 season of the Shaw Festival at University of Houston at Clear Lake. The work for the theater at University of Houston at Clear Lake was in the last week of May and 3 weeks in June, with the shows at the end of June. For 6 weeks, I worked at the Alley Theater as a carpenter on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I was staying at my parents' house at the time, which was a long drive to get to the Alley Theater downtown. My friend David from third grade let me live in his house for 6 weeks and take the bus to the Alley Theater as he lived in the Heights of Houston, and it was a short bus ride downtown. There were other carpenters overhired from out of town, and the theater put them up at a hotel, but I did not get this treatment. I began working as the technical director of the 1990 Shaw Festival at the University of Houston at Clear Lake Theater after completing my contract with the Alley Theater. I oversaw 3 carpenters who I had to keep busy. Jeff designed the set for 2 of the shows, and a student designed the set for the children's show. Jeff's designs for Arms and the Man were intricate, and all the flats that made up the walls of the set had fancy shaped sides of decorative trim. Jeff had made scale models of each of the scenes in this fancy set. The other show he designed was just a raised stage and lighting with 2 desks, one on either end of the raised stage. The raised stage was in both shows. To get the carpenters to cut the shaped trim for Arms and the Man, I showed them how to grid off half-inch plywood in 1-foot squares. Then I drafted scale drawings of the shapes of the sides of the walls from Jeff's models with a grid of 1-inch squares over them. The scale was 1 inch equals 1 foot. Then the carpenters could transfer the design onto the plywood following the grid and cut the shape out with a jigsaw. I called this procedure cutting froof and had a hand signal that I used to communicate it to the 3 carpenters. The design of the fancy set called for some 4-foot decorative columns. I laminated 4-inch thick styrofoam squares with liquid nails into a 12-inch by 12-inch wide 4-foot tall beam. Then I took a piece of plywood 12-inch by 12-inch square and put a bolt through the dead center of it with drywall screws sticking out the bottom and put the bolt into the chuck on a tall drill press. On the base of the drill press, I took a Lazy Susan caster that spun and attached a piece of plywood to it with drywall screws sticking up on its top. I sandwiched the foam beam into the drill press between the caster with screws sticking up and the plywood piece that was in the chuck of the drill press with its screws sticking down. I turned on the drill press and the foam beam began to spin. I then used a Sureform rasp to shape the spinning foam beam until I had a shaped column matching Jeff's model. I repeated the process until I had 2 shaped columns the right size. I was working all day with the carpenters. Then at night I would stay and draft drawings for the carpenters to use the next day. I was sleeping in the green room of the theater that was next to the shop until security, seeing my car at all hours of the night, told me I could not do that anymore, so I started going home to my parents' house at night. One of the scenes of Arms and the Man was the outside of a cottage that had 2 walls and a roof. For the roof, I built rafters out of 1 by 4-inch beams and put flats on top of this structure. Then I had the carpenters cut rows of cardboard shingles that we glued to the flats and painted it a solid color of brown. Then Jeff put assorted colors of paint into a Hudson pump-up sprayer, 1 color at a time, and sprayed the paint onto the cardboard shingles, spattering them to give them texture. Each scene was built on a platform with casters the same height as the raised stage. We called them wagons, and they locked into the raised stage with coffin locks. They could be moved to change the scenes. On my parents' street, there was a young lady named Audra who had broken up with my friend Rod. I struck up a friendship with her, and she came to see Arms and the Man when I was working as the stage manager. I did not have to perform this role as I was the technical director, but I volunteered because the set changes were complex. She enjoyed the show and said she wanted to take me to a show I did not work on. She told me she tried to get tickets to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at the Alley Theater, but it was sold out. I told her I had worked on that show also, used my connections, and arranged to see it with her from a tech box balcony at the back of the theater. I met my connection at the elevator in the lobby of the Alley Theater, and he took us to the booth in the back wall of the theater, and we watched the show from there. We had an enjoyable time and went to dinner after the show. However, she told me she did not want to date someone who had been divorced, and we went our separate ways. When she told me this, I tried to not be upset, but I had an episode at my parents' house where I was hearing voices other than the mumbling weather radio voices. I guess it upset me more than I wanted it to. After the Shaw Festival was over, I had nothing lined up and had not secured a permanent job at the Alley Theater, so I went back to ABFZ Oil Tools and John hired me again. Chapter 42. Back to Oil Tools. When I went back to ABFZ Oil Tools, Harold, who worked for Drillmortex in the same building, said that things had changed. There was a person named Butch who was new to the Pearland facility, who had been the district manager of the Houston location of ABFZ Oil Tools, but had gotten in trouble when several employees sued ABFZ Oil Tools over his abusive behavior. Butch had worked for the company 21 years. The regional manager, WR, had given Butch one more chance and sent him to Pearland in lieu of firing him. Butch did not like me from day one because John had let me work other jobs and come back to work at ABFZ Oil Tools. Butch saw employees as underlings that were less than human. He was very anti-employee and did not like having to give anyone their deserved benefits. Drill Mortex soon left the Pearland facility so that it was all just ABFZ Oil Tools there now. Before they left, Harold had quit because he saw no future in Drill Mortex and went to a small company with better chances of advancement. There was no more drinking beer after work. Butch came early and stayed late and came to work every day of the week. He literally lived for that job. He would even come into work on Christmas Day. John had a deal where he would get paid for being on call on the weekends so that he remained sober and could come to work if he were needed to get a tool for one of the districts. Butch told him that if he wanted that on-call money, he would have to come into work. So, John was not on call on the weekends anymore. Butch would be there if the districts needed anything. At first, I went back to typing the invoices in the office. Butch wanted to approve all the bills that John normally sent to Houston. At first, Butch showed me how to stamp the invoice and route it to a certain account, but quickly did not trust me and did it all himself, including typing the invoices. I stopped working in the office altogether and just worked out in the shop. Butch was highly intelligent and I learned a lot from him, but he was abusive to employees. There were hundreds of large bearing sets that came out of drilling heads. Butch had a fixture made to rebuild them. We would go through them and scrap the damaged bearings and keep the good ones. You would put the good bearing in the fixture and torque it down with a prescribed amount of torque with a torque wrench, then measure in 4 spots around the fixture where there were little cutouts with a micrometer, and then add the measurements up and average them. Then use a formula to determine the thickness needed for a spacer that went in the middle of the bearing set. Butch had me take all the spacers from the scrap bearings and measure them with the micrometer and mark them with this measurement. Then we could pull a spacer that was the right size out of this stock, and if there were not any spacers the right size, we could pull a spacer that was thicker than we needed, and Butch would get it ground to size at a machine shop. When I did this task, I would write the measurements on a piece of paper so I did not make a mistake. Butch came out to check to see if I was doing it correctly and started yelling at me because he thought I was looking at the measurements I had already written down when I was trying to write them down a second time. I was starting to hear voices and was shaking and said that him yelling at me was bad for my health. He snapped back, "I don't give a damn about your health." Butch would often come in the break room just after 8 a.m. and yell at everyone to go to work. We had temporaries come through the shop and work for a while and quit from the abuse, but I stayed. I began drinking beer at my parents' house after work because I was so wound up at the end of each day working with such an abusive boss. My land was only habitable for a brief time in the spring and fall and was usually flooded in the spring, so I still lived with my parents most of the year. I drank a 12-pack of beer every day after work and would pass out hearing the weather radio voices. I was self-medicating that way. I had stopped smoking pot as I had no connection from which to buy it and no place to smoke it anyway. I just drank beer. My father did not like me drinking, but he let me as I did not bother anyone. I stayed in my room after work and drank 12 beers and would pass out around 10 p.m. My father would complain that I drank 12 beers a night, but he still let me live at his house. WR said Butch could hire a mechanic to work in the shop, and I was in line to get this job. The job paid $8 an hour when I only made $6 an hour working for Manpower as a temporary. Butch did not want to hire me. He wanted to hire someone off the street, and then I would have to train that person. John told Butch that I would quit if they hired someone off the street, and David, my friend from 3rd grade, told me that the company he was working for was hiring punch-out construction workers for a general contractor building large apartment complexes. I told Butch that I needed to know if he were going to hire me as an oil field mechanic or not, so I could take this other job instead if I had to. John also put pressure on him, and reluctantly he hired me, and I became an ABFZ Oil Tools employee, making $8 an hour. Butch had paid a freelance welder to rebuild the outer sleeve of drive bushings by building them up with weld. Butch had a roller contraption built that was a low box with two metal rollers powered by a geared-down motor and had a foot pedal to control it. The welder would put the outer sleeve of the drive bushing on the rollers, and then, using the foot pedal, make it roll, so all he had to do was hold the wire-feed MIG welding torch over the bushing and spin it with the roller contraption and lay in the weld. This was a lot smoother than welding a little, then stopping and turning the bushing by hand, then welding a little more. The welder could sit there and run the weld continuously for hours. WR complained that he was paying a lot for an outside contractor to weld, so he let Butch hire a welder that WR had seen working temporary at the Houston district. His name was Donnie, and he had an ego that was huge. He was the welder, and I was only there to help him with grinding. Donnie made $13 an hour, and he told everyone all about it. WR, the regional manager, saw me heating drive bushings with a propane torch. Drive bushings had an outer ring that the welder would build up worn areas with weld before Butch sent them to a machine shop to be machined. But drive ring assemblies had an inner metal bushing that was held in with molded rubber. To weld up the outer drive ring, the assemblies had to be separated. This required putting them in a fixture with a hydraulic ram and heating them with a propane torch until the rubber melted, then pressing the metal bushing and rubber out, then burning the remaining rubber in the outer bushing to dust and grinding it clean with a big grinder with a wire brush. WR saw me doing this in a t-shirt and blue jeans and told John that he needed to get us some coveralls. John went to get us uniforms from a uniform supply company, and Butch complained that he did not want us to get uniforms because it would just cause problems. So, John went home that day without completing the order. The next day, John tried again to put in an order, and Butch saw him doing it and said, "I thought we talked about this and decided not to get uniforms." John said that we needed uniforms because we were working with open flames. Butch went into his office and then came back a while later and said, WR said no. So, we did not get uniforms ordered that day. John knew this was a lie, as WR was the one who told him to get uniforms, so he must have called WR. Because Butch changed his mind and let John put in the order the next day. I was pressing out bushings the next day and had a hole in my jeans and got burned. I told Butch that I would not have gotten burned if I had had a uniform, and he said, "Well, I put in the order for them." This was a lie. John put in the order for them, and Butch had lied to us to try and stop him. It just goes to show that Butch would lie to us to try to keep us from receiving any benefits, even safety gear. But he already told me he does not give a damn about my health.